I think it's very ironic that we, as you both mentioned, restraints and seclusions are always teamed together, and you never hear the word transport even mentioned, which is actually part of an issue that just hasn't been addressed, the transporting of students to those seclusion locations.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, and Joe, I don't know what your take is on it, but I was reading carefully through the latest legislation, and what's interesting is not only does the general population seem to draw this distinction between what we would call a physical escort, we call it transportation, other people call it physical escorts. They draw a distinction between moving someone and immobilizing someone. And even in the most recent legislation that I read, they parcel out escorts, and they say that these restrictions do not apply to escorts. There's another pre-existing document that refers to that, and then they reference the document. Which I think is kind of interesting. And I found that a lot of parents also don't recognize physical escorts as restraint. We consider them restraint, albeit less restrictive, less intrusive, what have you. But a lot of the general public does not really view that as restraint. They view restraint as holding someone down, oftentimes.
And Merrill, that's a really good point you just broached. And I think before we go further down this road, I think we really should go over the terminology, like as Voltaire would say, define your terms as you're talking to me, because otherwise I think the listeners are going to be a little bit confused as we use these terms, timeout, seclusion, restraint, and everything else. And I think it would be good, if you don't mind, if we just refresh a little bit there. Okay. Yep. For the timeout purposes itself, there's several different categories of timeout. There's inclusion timeout, okay? It's a very evidence-based research procedure. And that's typically, most of us have been in inclusion timeout during our lives. In other words, you're in the classroom, you cause a little problem or whatever, and maybe the teacher moves you several feet away or whatever. It's timeout from reinforcement there. Very evidence-based, works very effectively. Many parents, teachers have used that thing. The next most restrictive type is exclusion timeout. And exclusion timeout is, many of us have been this one too, is now you're removed from the educational environment. So how many here, have ever been in their academic careers, been in the hallway in the desk or the seat or whatever outside of the classroom, where you're removed from the academic environment? Not a big fan of exclusion timeout for the simple fact that if you've ever been in it, you probably realize that the teacher forgets about you quite a while. In other words, you've been out in the hallway and not there. Right. So there's better types of exclusion timeout.
But, it's interesting. In the legislation, there seems to be a distinction between self-imposed timeout or cool down and imposed timeout.
And that is a very important distinction of a cool down room as opposed to a seclusion room. But exclusion, again, is removing them from the environment. My recommendation would be an interclass timeout. So in other words, is rather than putting him where he's unsupervised, the student's unsupervised in the hallway, I go, Ted, you're my colleague, you watch the student, because typically the problem with the student is with the teacher and back and forth. So if I put him in a neutral classroom, he doesn't have the issues, the behavioral issues with you. So in other words, is when he comes down, he's supervised. He's not in my math academic environment, but maybe he's in your language arts class.
Right.
You're not going to leave him there all day.
Right.
Because you're going to remind me pretty quickly, I got a student in your thing. So you're going to send him back, but he's supervised. He's in an educational environment. Seclusion is the one I'm really not a fan of at all, because there's no real evidence base even behind it. And this is basically where you're removing a child to a room and preventing him or her from leaving that room in a secluded area. These are becoming more and more common across the United States, even with our state of South Carolina here. Schools are starting to develop these things. It's not a very evidence-based procedure. And so if they're going to use it, the only recommendation would be for safety procedures itself. But then we lead into this escort, which Merrill just perfectly led into, is how do you get a child into a seclusion room when I don't want to go? In other words, is rather than using de-escalation procedures, which many of the programs such as Merrill runs would teach teachers how to do de-escalate, verbally de-escalate it, you're actually doing the opposite. You're kind of throwing fuel on the fire by trying to get him or her to a room that they don't want to go to, which is typically going to lead then to restraint.
Right.
That's one of the reasons that many of the residents that I've worked with, residential and special day schools, is they are closely interlinked. Because if they're going to do the seclusion, many times it ends up being a restraint procedure that goes down afterwards.
Merrill, would you agree that de-escalation is an area that really needs to be a focus in future training?
Yeah, I think tremendously. I mean, more so than de-escalation, though, and I'll touch on it again if you like. Many people they can do de-escalation, but they do it all day long, every day, and it burns their staff out because they're not doing good prevention. So, de-escalation is great. And yes, most people do not do it properly or at all. But even the people that do it properly, they do it too much. They do it all day long. They do it every 10 minutes, which is taking away from academic time because they're not doing good prevention. They don't have good programs in place. They don't have the proper academics. They don't have the proper supervision. Take your pick. But I would agree that yes, and I see it all the time when I go into classrooms. I see children that I don't even know them. And I can see that they are beginning to get off task and heading towards a crisis. And the teacher does nothing until they've thrown a chair. So, yeah, absolutely. People need to sharpen their de-escalation skills. But they do need to go beyond that as well. Into the area of prevention, good prevention, which falls under the heading, I guess, of classroom management. If you have good classroom management, you probably are doing good prevention.
Well, certainly there is a challenge now. The educational environments are now seeing more and more students that traditionally have not been in them. And with teacher shortages and the movement to generic special education classrooms, we're seeing more and more of these issues approaching the classrooms that traditionally have not been there before.
And a lot of these procedures were used in more restrictive settings, such as residential and special day schools. And with the least restrictive environment movement over the last several decades, what you've seen is a lot of these interventions migrate with the children to public school environments, to self-contained, resource, and now more to general education settings, which exactly as Merrill said is emphasizes the point that you really need good positive behavioral interventions to prevent them. You need good academic instruction also, but you also need to have de-escalation skills, which is a real crisis in the schools. If you don't have these to prevent them or recognize it when a child's going up the cycle of aggression, how to respond appropriately during those phases of the cycle of aggression, many times teachers may inadvertently exacerbate the situation rather than pacify it.
Right. And Merrill, you mentioned classroom management and also professional development. Yeah.
I think that, when I go in the schools, many times they want me to write an individual program plan or a behavior support plan for the child. And many times I tell them that that's going to be a waste of my time because the classroom management skills are so poor that it's really not going to make any point. And a lot of times lately, especially, what we've been emphasizing is your teachers need to get some fundamental training and the paraprofessionals because they are making the most common blunders that if they corrected those, 80% of their problems would disappear and you would really only be left with, as in the positive behavioral supports paradigm, you really only be left with those very, very difficult, intractable children who, I shouldn't say intractable, but complex, more severe. And more of these nuisance behaviors, the things that often turn into a crisis, would be all but eliminated, I think. Yeah.
And again, you broached another area again that I think needs a little bit of elaboration, just because we don't know what the lowest common denominator of our observers
are. Keep us on track.
Positive behavior sports is a hugely important aspect of this. And basically what Merrill was referencing was basically what you'll see is a pyramid structure. And based on the medical model, it's primary interventions, secondary, and tertiary. And primary is school-wide. That everybody within the school should be applying, and these will help keep down a lot of the behavior problems that you see, especially transition areas, unstructured areas, recess, hallways, and such. But not just because you have good rules and everything else in setting, not all the kids are going to respond. About 80% of them will, but you're still going to have 15 to 20% who probably will not respond.
Well, and then
you'll have those secondary interventions.
And I'm seeing more and more issues of fidelity towards the support model and the training of staff and in the implementation of the expected model you're talking about. Are you seeing that as well?
It's growing. I mean, even if you looked at the legislation for both the Congress and also for the Senate bills, you'll see that within there, the importance of that. However, again, it's not in all schools. It's not in all states. It's growing. It needs to be expanded.